The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 16th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. But what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. We might want a sermon. It's okay. Shortest sermon these folks have ever heard. When I was young, I used to go into Omaha to visit my grandparents. And in Grandma's house, down in the basement, there was this cupboard. And in the cupboard were stacks and stacks of comic books. And we would spend hours, myself and my brothers and my cousins, and we would read through those comic books over and over and over again. It didn't matter that they were the same stories. We would just keep going back. You know those stories. Of course, there were the relatively benign ones, Archie and the Gang and Casper the Friendly Ghost and so forth. But then there were the superheroes. Batman, Spider-Man, Superman, may have even been the Incredible Hulk. All of those superheroes that in some way shaped and formed the story that I wanted to be able to relate to, that I wanted to be able to connect to in some way or another. Now, that was back in the late 60s and early 70s, maybe even early 60s, but we won't push it too much earlier than that. And what we know is for most of those superheroes to come into being, often it came out of some industrial accident, whether it had to do with our fears about the atomic age that was coming into fullness, or whether it were fears about chemical kinds of engineering stuff going on. Whatever the case, most of those superheroes came out of having special abilities that were grounded in these accidents. Superman was kind of different. Superman, if I remember the story right, was this little baby that his parents were trying to protect, and so they shipped him away from his home planet to Earth where he would be safe. But what was normal on his home planet made him extraordinary here. In many ways, over the past century, our culture, our nation has had kind of a love affair with superheroes. We really value the stories that they bear and the ways that they bring those super extraordinary abilities to bear, particularly for the sake of the little people, the vulnerable people, the people who are at risk. I wonder if in some ways, even though those disciples had no understanding of superheroes in the way that we know superhero stories, if when they answered the question, when Peter said last week, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God," I wonder if some ways what they weren't expecting was some kind of a superhero. If being Messiah what hadn't been built up in the story of their tradition, that somebody was going to come on their behalf and kick butt. They had been living under the pressures of the Roman Empire for quite some time. And before that, it was the Babylonians. And before that, they had a long history as the Jewish people of being a people who needed somebody to come and take care of business for them. They needed and wanted a superhero. Somebody who had special powers, who is invincible in some ways, who would come and take care of business. And you know, those disciples, well, they were standing in a long line of folks. Did you hear Jeremiah this morning? Oh, Lord, you know. Take care of those people who bring retribution upon those people who are persecuting me. I have been living faithfully, and it's painful. It's not the way I want it to go. And the Lord's response to Jeremiah, well, quite frankly, it's a little bit disconcerting. If you will turn to me, if you will reorient yourself more and clearly toward me, then I will take you back. The Lord calls Jeremiah to reorient his life. And so when the disciples and the Jewish people are, quite frankly, the people of Israel are looking and hoping for this superhero to come, and then Jesus starts, after they got the answer right, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Remember what Jesus did next. He blessed Peter. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. You shall be called Rock, Peter, Petros. You shall be rock, and on you I will found my church. And the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And you will have authority. You'll have authority to bind and loose, to interpret the law and the prophets, to determine whether in this particular circumstance God's law applies. That's pretty big authority. But then comes what we hear today, and Jesus begins to say, but here's what it means to be Messiah, just in case you were expecting something else. What it means to be Messiah is that I must go to Jerusalem, and when I get there, I will undergo great suffering at the hands of the key leaders, particularly the leaders of our own religious tradition. And I will die. Now, Peter's a great editor, don't you think? Peter's this editor who says, but Jesus, that story will never sell. That's a weak story. It's a lame story. It can't go that way. God forbid it. And Jesus says, well, you see, there's a problem here. You see, in so many ways, you are getting caught up, Peter, and all the rest of y'all, huh? You are getting caught up in the way that humans do things, and you're not paying attention to the bigger plan, God's plan. You are tempting me to do things the way things normally happen in these parts. And the one who tempts, in Jewish tradition, in the Hebrew tradition, the one who has the role of the tempter has a title, Ha-Satan, Satan. The role of the tempter is to test, did you hear it in the psalm? Is to test the faith and faithfulness, test the limits, find where the boundary is between being faithful and not behaving faithfully. Peter, you are testing my commitment to follow God's way as opposed to going about doing things the way it's always done in human experience. And what's more, anybody who wants to follow me needs to deny self. And the word for that actually is a word that's related to what we would understand to have to do with our psyche, if you will. This is not some kind of psychological suicide call, but rather, well, Presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton of the ELCA was in the Synod a while back, and she talked about what it is to be Lutheran, particularly the ELCA, and she talked about the way that worship is definitive, is fundamental, is core to who we are. That worship isn't something that we do alongside all the other good ministries, but rather worship is that one thing that we do that defines who we are as faithful Christians. That we come and we worship, and everything that we do is empowered and strengthened out of that. One of the ways that she put it is, in worship, we get over ourselves. Now, if you're at all like me, I'm not sure I really want to get over myself. I kind of like things going the way I am used to them going. Now, you may not be at all like me, but for me, I want things to be the way I would like them to be, and I want them to be in such a way that basically my world and my construction of the world is the way it ought to be, don't you think? And what Bishop Eaton does is she invites us to be clear that when we come to worship, when we hear the word of God proclaimed, when we pray together, when we dine at this table, we are invited into a much larger reality, and that larger reality is God's reign, God's mission that has been invoked and brought into our presence by the person of Jesus Christ. And in the midst of that, we have an opportunity to let go of all the things that we want to cling to. We can get over ourselves. Not sure I like it, even when I kind of understand it. That's what I imagine Jesus saying it means to deny ourselves, to let go of all the stuff that we so naturally cling to, and to, remember that word to Jeremiah? Reorient our lives. To turn towards God, to turn towards Jesus. The next thing Jesus says is, you need to take up your cross. Now, what we need to know is, what we remember is that, first of all, a cross is an instrument of state-sponsored terrorism that was intended to terrify people into staying in line. Now, people didn't get up onto the cross by being nice. People found themselves on a cross for violating the norms of the community. Quite frankly, most of the time, what Jesus is inviting us to do in taking up our cross is to orient ourselves in such a way that we are upholding that Hebrew tradition that says that we are called to attend to the needs of those who are on the margins, those who are most vulnerable, those who are at risk in any number of ways. The Hebrew tradition talks about caring for the widow and the orphan and the foreigner in our land. That we are called as faithful people to align ourselves with those who are most at risk, those who are vulnerable. And when we do that, that means that, like Jesus, we will follow Jesus. And where Jesus is going is to Jerusalem, where he will speak truth to power, where he will challenge the way things are and the way things are going. And he's not challenging it just for his own sake, but rather he is challenging it for the sake of those who are being crushed by the policies and the actions of those who have power and authority. And what Jesus says is, guess what? Being Messiah, but also being disciple of the Messiah is not comfortable. It's not easy. And as Jeremiah learned, being faithful can come with a whole lot of pain and difficulty. And yet, the promise is that when we dare to enter into this, something happens. That through denying self and taking up our cross and following Jesus, in the midst of that, somewhere we experience life. We experience freedom. We experience forgiveness. We experience reconciliation. We experience new life. So the challenge is, if we want to find superheroes, we need to go to the movie theater or to the comic books. But the promise of life that changes everything, that brings us into an experience of God's presence in our midst, what Jesus calls the kingdom of heaven, then we orient ourselves toward the Son of Man, toward the Son of the living God, who shows us a way to new life.